One side of my family is in the Midwest, and I have a companion that moved from Portland back to outside Boston. I originally got the idea for a cross-country, mostly by train trip in 2019 when they were rehabbing the apartment I was in and were offering a large amount of money to not have to store my stuff and put me in a hotel for a month. But I was still a temporary employee at the time, and my supervisor was non-committal about having me back afterwards. I finally did the trip in 2024 and decided to do it again this year for America's 250th and also discover the amazing train trip across much of Canada. So on June 19th, I boarded Amtrak's Empire Builder. This was my pair of seats for the next 2 nights. This was the observation car. We went through the Columbia River Gorge, saw the dams and the rock formations. And the derailment. This is near Pasco. Next day we went across northern Montana and North Dakota. I decided to pay to have breakfast in the dining car. This is the Theodore Roosevelt obelisk at the top of Marias Pass. Lunch with very unhealthy desserts I didn't eat. This is Montana. This is James J. Hill, the empire builder who built the railroad. This is Fort Union, just inside North Dakota, which was a fur trading post and is now a national park site. This is Minot. Next morning we came into Minnesota. We passed the stations on their abandoned commuter rail line and came into St. Paul, where they spent a ton of money on reopening their abandoned depot. I got breakfast at a diner, then took buses to Minneapolis and then to where I met my uncle, who I stayed with for 2 nights. Since this is Minnesota, he's on a lake and has a boat he took me out on. We also checked out some local underused parks and took a tour of an Amazon facility. I helped him start pressure washing his deck. They both had functions, so I had them drop me at Mall of America, which has a log chute ride my half-brother took my mother into coming on. On June 23rd, my uncle dropped me off and I headed to downtown Minneapolis, where I took Greyhound across Wisconsin to Green Bay, where I stayed at the Hyatt Regency for 2 nights. I got a cheap upgrade to a room with a whole separate living area, and they had a nice pool. I checked out their riverfront where they had these neat built-in lounge chairs and art. I felt bad that it is useless so many months of the year. The next day my aunt came and we toured Lambeau Field. This is the tunnel the team comes out of. They wouldn't let us touch the field. This is in the pro shop. Note the license plate. Then we went to a car museum. Which also has some James Bond cars. We also went to a cultural center which mostly had an Old West exhibit. The next day I took a bus to Madison, including through yet more road construction, where I took a bus to Albright Botanical Gardens, which is just an amazing place. The driver of the tour tram had to shoo a turtle off the path. It's where my mother's brick is, as she was cremated and doesn't have a headstone, and has one of the only Thai pavilions outside Thailand. They also have an indoor conservatory. Then I walked to the Airbnb I gave into, as the hotels were more expensive than I was expecting. The next day I checked out the neighborhoods I grew up in. The yellow building was my daycare, and the brick addition is where the playground was. This is Yahara River, which connects the two lakes Central Madison is in between. The co-op where I ate 2 or 3 Dove ice cream bars behind my mother's back. Then I went to the university campus. This is the dairy barn, which birthed modern nutrition, and in a later building, vitamins A and B were discovered. This is Babcock Hall, where I got too much ice cream, but it's made right there from cows a block away. The view from Picnic Point, which juts out into the lake. More of the campus, including Memorial Union, a popular gathering spot. The next day, my half-brother came and we went to the farmer's market, which surrounds the state capitol, which has an observation deck we went up to. This is the beach I swam at as a kid, the park where my mother's ashes were spread, one of the houses we lived in, the lower elementary school I went to. Remember, this was in late June. The locks that are used to connect 2 of Madison's lakes. Madison used to be home to Oscar Mayer. The next day I took a bus to meet up with my half-brother again, and he took me to an electric railway operation in Old Road, Wisconsin, which demonstrates various ways how people used to live. Then I left my half-brother and took buses to Milwaukee, where I ended up in a secret spy safe house for dinner. On June 29th, I took Amtrak to Chicago. I took the L, since it was hot out, to the Cultural Center, which had art, and just some incredible architecture. I also checked out the Bean, where I saw this guy. This is Buckingham Fountain, and the lions outside the Art Institute, the hostel I stayed at for 2 nights. The next day I went to the Field Museum, which is absolutely mammoth. Just one section could be a museum on its own. This is soon one of the best T-Rex ever found. The crowd trying to board the bus after closing. Then I went to the Sears Tower Sky Deck, where they have an experience in the basement before going up. The next day I went to the Shedd Aquarium and saw the dolphin and beluga whale shows. Then I happened to see the train I took to Boston, including along the Erie Canal, and then took a commuter train to the town my companion lives in, which has a cafe with the Real Deal juicer. I saw their Independence Day Festival and fireworks, which they hold a day early. On July 4th, I headed into Boston and saw their parade, the annual reading of the Declaration of Independence that they've done since the very beginning. I went to the Charlestown Navy Yard in hopes of seeing the USS Constitution return from being turned around, but I did get to see their visitor center and the 1805 Commandant's House. I went to wait for the Boston Pops concert to start, and we were evacuated to the highway tunnel due to an oncoming storm cell. But the event did go on an hour late. I didn't really get to see any of the fireworks. That night I decided to stay at a hostel in Everett instead of waiting for the late commuter train and walk a long walk back. The next day I checked out a pedestrian bridge that goes right over the subway yard and walked up to the Bunker Hill Monument and climbed the 294 steps to the top. Then checked out the Bunker Hill Museum across the street. Then I followed the Freedom Trail back to the Navy Yard, where I was able to tour the USS Constitution. These are the hammocks the sailors would sleep in. I also went to the USS Constitution Museum nearby, which has historically themed mini golf outside. Then I walked through downtown Boston, the Common and the Public Garden. On July 8th, I took a bus to Albany, New York, where we used the bus station, while across the street Trailways just has a parking lot. I made to the Empire State Plaza, which is the state government complex, and is way out of scale, and has the Egg, a performance venue. One of the buildings has an observation deck. That's the state capitol down there. Underneath the plaza is an equally giant concourse. This is a bit of the State Museum I didn't have time for, as the bus was late and I had to head across the river to get to a train to Buffalo, where I stayed the night in an old hotel that happened to be adjacent to the Theodore Roosevelt inaugural site. This is downtown Buffalo, where I caught the express bus to Niagara Falls to meet my uncle from the Toronto area and tour the American side. Then head out of the country for the very first time and tour the Canadian side of the falls. I did the boat tour into the mist. Then we headed towards Toronto, past the power plants and the St. Lawrence Seaway. One of my relatives is a sign collector, and this is my uncle's house where I stayed for the 3 nights. The next day we got on go and went to downtown Toronto, where I went up to CN Tower. Then we met some other relatives and went to the Railway Museum, where they had a model of the train I took across Canada and a mini train that we rode. We walked past the arenas to lunch, where I was told to ask for some loonies and toonies. We then walked to the harbor front, and by the way, both Toronto and Vancouver were big into hosting World Cup matches. We took a cruise out into the harbor and around the Toronto Islands, after which I walked and walked trying to find a non-existent phone charger rental, and took the train and bus back late. The next day I did a backroads bike ride and watched the soccer game with family. Then on July 12th I headed into Toronto and Via Rail's Business Lounge, where I checked in for 4 days and 4 nights on the Canadian train. This was my daytime seat, however I was rarely in it, as I spent the time in one of the 4 dome cars just like the one ahead. Overall, it's just an incredible train and the activities. The rail cars from 1955, The three-course meals, the cruise, the scenery are all amazing. I love how they have puzzles and games. It's such a tiny cost and a great way to pass the time and meet fellow travelers. This is the end of the train, which for much of the time is reserved for prestige class. This was my bed that gets folded down for night. They have a continental breakfast spread, in addition to the sit-down. This is in Northern Ontario, including crossing the Canadian Shield and Parry Sound Station. The next day we crossed more of Northern Ontario. This is in Manitoba. Crossing the largest Treadwell Bridge, passing a derailment. The Canadian Prairies in Saskatchewan. This is Saskatoon. This is Edmonton, where there is some recent flooding. Getting into the Rockies, approaching Jasper, where we had an hour off the train. And I found an indigenous exhibit. This is in the Rockies after Jasper. Paradise Falls. Due to the train's lateness, I missed some of the Rockies, but was able to get up a little late at 5 a.m. the next morning and see Fraser Canyon in daylight. This is Boston Bar, where they were staging for forest fires, which we were warned might end the trip early. We actually got lucky in that the train we met going the other way couldn't continue and had to back up due to the fires in the east. I was surprised to see log rafts. This is coming into Vancouver. That's their SkyTrain. Overall, we were up to 14 hours late at one point due to the heat restrictions in freight trains one day, a sick passenger overnight, a crossing incident ahead of us, and a bridge strike ahead of us, but with scheduled padding ended up only 4.5 hours late. This is their Pacific Central station. I liked how they covered the telephones with pictures. This is the hostel I ended up staying at for 4 nights. One of the bunks I was in, and I was happy to find that they had planned trips, as I had no idea what to do. They also had 2 rooftops. This is the night view from one of them. They served breakfast, and we're right near False Creek, which has ferries which are too cute, and down the seawall path from English Bay, also in case you forget which country you're in. Anyways, on the July 17th trip, we walked through downtown Vancouver, rode and then the C-bus ferry to a local bus up into Capilano Canyon, which has one of their water reservoirs. This is overlooking the dam into the canyon. We then went on a hike alongside the canyon, stopping at the fish hatchery, which has fake and real fish, and saw a bald eagle. After that, we went to the Capilano Suspension Bridge, which opened in 1889, is now a big tourist attraction with a cliff walk, as well as walks through the treetops. This is the actual suspension bridge. The next day we took a ferry to Granville Island, which has a public food market, as well as studios where artists make and sell glassware, metalwork, brooms, and all sorts of other art. There's also houseboats, which I'm sure are very expensive, and yes, the seagulls will dive bomb any unattended food. Later I used a hostel discount to rent a bike and ride the mostly waterfront loop around Stanley Park. They even have horse-drawn tours. The next day I went out on my own and explored downtown Vancouver. This is the other railroad station and the Gastown steam clock, and a view from the Vancouver Lookout. That evening I took buses west to a beach by the UBC campus. On my final day, July 20th, I took SkyTrain, and and then 2 buses south to the last highway interchange before the U.S. border, from where I walked down the off-ramp, along the highway frontage, and through the Peace Arch into the United States. Unfortunately, I missed the connection, and then Customs took their sweet time to see me, so I just missed the direct bus from Blaine and had to wait an hour for the meandering one and wasn't up to sightseeing in the meantime. But the route was quite scenic. I did eventually make it to Bellingham, where I got another bus, further down I-5 to Mount Vernon, where I got lunch in a bus to Everett, and then Sound Transit bus and Link Light Rail to a Sounder train from downtown Seattle to Kent, where I stopped and saw someone, and then took buses to Tacoma, and from there, and finally Amtrak home.